take the long way home.
Before we get to the evening's entertainment, I mentioned in the front of the Building Through Time book, somewhere, I don't remember where now in the introduction, I think, that if you're going to go looking at houses, you need to take a book. If you go looking for birds, you take a book. If you go looking for rocks, you better take a mineral book. Same thing with buildings. Heartily recommend Virginia McAllister's book, A Field Guide to American Houses. And it takes you through chronologically the various styles that have come through the United States. Gives you a lot of basic information that I don't have time to give you. It's excellent, excellent book. It's available on eBay or Amazon, used copies. They're all basically the same. Well, they are all the same. This is a 1984 edition. She has just recently come out with a hardback. And it does have much better coverage on post-World War II material. But for the relative difference, this is $50, whereas the earlier one you can probably get for 10 or 12. Ideally, you put this one at home and you carry the other one in your car. So you get one of each. Because this is not something you want to carry in the car. It's just not that at all. Okay, let's turn out the lights and get started on part 2. Last time we were talking about very early techniques, sawmill, standard dimension lumber, that sort of thing as background, and the very simple houses that were being built. And when we went out at the end, and I pointed you over across the street to the Isaac Tudor house. And that's what we're looking at here. This is the Isaac Tudor house. The library will someday be here. This is Tudor's barn, which also has a cupola. But cupolas were very practical on barns, not so practical on houses. So there's only one cupola left in La Crosse today. Well, actually, there are two. One at the Martindale house that you're most familiar with, and there's another one that's a totally different kind of cupola that we'll talk about a little bit later this evening. So here's an aerial view of what the Tudor house, and it was a mansion for 1856. It was the biggest, best, showiest thing in La Crosse. And all you have to do is refer to those other buildings that I showed you last week, and very obvious difference in the quality. The most frustrating part about this whole story is we know very little about interiors. That photography wasn't easily available until the early to mid 1880s. So we don't know what most of these houses look like on the inside, which is one reason why I'm not showing you the insides. The other reason is because, for whatever reason, people very seldom photograph the interiors of their houses in the past. Anyway, the Isaac Tudor house there. Next slide, please. Greek Revival was the second major revival style that came through the United States. Roman Revival was the first, 1770s and later, particularly espoused by Thomas Jefferson. The Greek Revival started up in part as a response against the Roman Revival. Both a political response, because the Roman world, of course, turned into the empire of Rome, and many Americans didn't like the idea of modeling architecture, our architecture, on the architecture of an empire. So for a variety of reasons, the Roman revival style faded pretty quickly, and the Greek revival style came in to replace it. And Greek revival was popular from 1810 all the way into after the Civil War. And it ran alongside of, or the Gothic revival style ran alongside of the Greek revival style. They overlapped, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, they kind of overlapped. The Gothic revival continued on later than the Greek revival did. So we get some Gothic revival buildings into the 1880s occasionally. This business of style with buildings is a sticky one, and it's one that I'm afraid many people spend far more time worrying about than they should. To say that this is a pure Greek revival or a pure Gothic revival is really pretty nonsensical, all things considered, that there's not much in this world that's pure of any sort, much less when it comes to reviving a building style from another culture, from another time. I mean, there, after all, wasn't just one kind of Greek building. So which Greek building are we reviving? Which Roman building are we reviving? In some cases, we can say specifically, Thomas Jefferson built the library of the University of Virginia to model after the Pantheon in Rome. Well, that's about as direct a connection as you can make. Okay, fine. Except Jefferson's library was a library. It wasn't an ancient Roman temple. So the interior was quite different, decorated very differently, different function, different materials. Jefferson didn't have any concrete to build his university library with. So when talking about style, it's helpful to call this building basically Greek revival or even neoclassical revival. Neoclassical is even more generalized than Greek or Roman. The Greeks nor the Romans used wood, certainly not like this. They would have used brick or stone, covered it with marble. Here we've got a wooden frame covered with wooden clapboards. So no relationship whatsoever in terms of the materials or the size. About the only thing we can say in terms of Greek revival is we do have a pediment at the end of the house. It's not just a gable. A gable roof is, a double angle, same slope on each side. But when you connect the bottoms of the roof rafters, that makes it into a pediment, triangular form that the Greeks, Romans used on the fronts of their temples. We have wooden pilasters here on the corner, 2 stories high, one on each front corner. They were also on the rear. Those pilasters visually support the entablature that runs all the way around the house, that in turn supports the cornice, which is the base of the roof line. So these are somewhat Greek elements or neoclassical elements. The porch around 2 sides of the house, nothing like that in the ancient Greek world or the Roman world. And certainly when we talk about Greek houses or Roman houses, they didn't look like this at all. So this is a very generalized concept of the Greek world. And about all we've got here is the pediment and a couple of pilasters imitating freestanding columns. But it's Greek revival. One of the best examples in Crosse, and it's not a very good example. Crosse was founded late in terms of the Greek revival tradition. It had been rolling along for 40 years and was becoming somewhat out of date in many people's viewpoint, which is why they picked up on the Gothic revival. And then later, the Gothic revival goes out of favor and we get Italianate and some of the others that we'll talk about. Some of this is a push by people who want something new. That old Greek stuff I'm not interested in. What have you got that's new? Well, the carpenter goes through his book and he says, hey, out on the East Coast, they're doing Gothic now. Why don't we do you a Gothic house? And, oh, well, we'll flip a few more pages over and yeah, here's a nice design you can use. We think La Crosse out at the end of the railroad. By 1858, the railroad connected us to Milwaukee and Chicago and every other place that was accessible at that time. So La Crosse was not really isolated. The newspapers came every day from New York, from Chicago, from Milwaukee. If you really had to get in touch with somebody on the East Coast, the telegraph was there. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was pretty quick. So while we were physically stuck out here on the edge of civilization, there was all this input from the East Coast, from Chicago, from the Milwaukee area. So they were very conscious of what were the latest fashions in women's clothing, as well as the latest fashions in houses. Next slide. Here's the house today. It's all basically there. The porch has been screened in, and then these little knee walls put in between the columns. And a second floor porch has been added, which is unfortunate because that obscures the whole pediment and the pilasters. So you don't see the neoclassical element there at all. Unfortunate, but it hasn't been altered significantly. 2 days work and you could strip that porch clean and take off that upper porch and you'd be close back to what the original house looked like. Next slide. We move around to the side, you see this 2-story bay that sticks out from the side. Not original. Neoclassical style houses generally were very symmetrical. They wouldn't have had a wing sticking off the side of that. Give me the next one. That doesn't, it was well done, the addition was well done, but the pilasters, there. They've got nice pilasters here on the angles of the bay, but look at that window. You would never build a window like that right up against the bay that's sticking out. So that becomes a very clear indicator that something fishy's here. We've got an addition. And in fact, what was fishy was the addition of this 2-story bay to give a nice downstairs sitting room and some extra space upstairs. And that was probably done in the late 1860s. Because I've got another house that we're going to look at that we do have a pretty sure date on, and it uses exactly the same kind of bay, except without the neoclassical decoration. Next slide. There was a strange house, Alexander Macmillan, one of the Macmillan brothers. There were, I think, 4 Macmillan brothers and 1 nephew that was a Macmillan that came down out of Nova Scotia to La Crosse. And Alexander and Duncan Macmillan were the 2 oldest, and they came first. Duncan supposedly was the first man to float a raft of logs from La Crosse down to port down in Iowa, central Iowa. The town no longer even exists today. It was washed away by one of the changes in the river. But he single-handedly took the first raft of logs down the river, which must have been an incredible feat. If you ever got some time, you're up in the archives, look at some of the photos of the log rafts or later on lumber rafts made of dimension-cut lumber, tied together with stakes, and they were huge. They were as big as some of the 8 and 10 barge loads that you see on the river today, except the lumber rafts were controlled by men with very long oars to help steer the thing as it floated down river. But anyway, Alexander Macmillan built this house over on 7th for himself. It's now gone. It's a very typical Italianate house that I'll talk about in a minute, but I want first to talk about an addition that he made to the house. And that addition is right here. And it's a copy of the Choragic Monument of Lysicrates that was in Athens, very popular monument with tourists. All the tourists wanted images of the Choragic Monument of Lysicrates. And Macmillan built a little one off of his dining room. Next slide. I do have one photo of it that you can see here. Very well done. I mean, his entablature, his columns, the whole thing is very carefully done. I'm sure taken out of one of several books that would have had this information available. Macmillan was quite avant-garde for the time. Back up for me, Barry. You see here a wind pump with a reservoir up in the tower. So we would pump water up into the reservoir, and then the reservoir would provide gravity-fed water to the house. You either use gravity feed for your house, or you use our system today that have big pumps that always are keeping pressure on the water line. Gravity fed is a lot cheaper and easier. So that's what that was. The lower portion of it was a pigeon coop. Pigeons great eating, and so they would often combine these kinds of structures. It's not what we would think of normally as a formal kind of garden, but Macmillan was very, very highly thought of in the community, very wealthy man. So whatever he wanted to do, he did, and everybody said, wow, isn't that interesting? You know, if I did it, I'd be crazy, but if Macmillan does it, it's interesting. You see also that little corner tower that in the later photo, it had been chopped off right here at the roof line. That, unfortunately, was the fate of many of these towers in town. People decide they're just not worth it, they leak, there's no real space up there, let's just chop it off next time we put a new roof on the house. Next slide. And next. One other little Greek Revival house. This was on 3rd, almost at Cass, when I first came to town. It was owned by a carpenter and was proclaimed in the community as one of the most significant Greek Revival houses in town. Well, I took that with a very large grain of salt because it's not. But it was. And just recently, it's been, you know, since I came to town in '68, so it's been 40 plus years, and finally, next slide please, a photo has shown up. The 2 pediments, one here, supported by paired columns, not those spindly little lathe turn posts that we saw. I do think that the pediment that was added over the entrance was probably a significant addition to the house. It certainly wouldn't have detracted from it, but this was the appearance of it about 1898, 95, 98, in that time period. So we did have a little bit of neoclassicism in La Crosse, but not much. Next slide. Same thing with the Gothic revival. All of these styles have sub-styles and sub-sub-styles and variants on the sub-sub-styles. So this is cottage Gothic as opposed to large-scale Gothic that you would use for a mansion or a church or a university. University Gothic revival is different from church Gothic revival, which is different from domestic Gothic revival. So it's much more complicated than what I'm giving you. But this was very typical little house of the cottage Gothic variety. The main house, the long side runs toward the street, and then we have a wing here that sticks out toward the street, essentially making a T-shaped plan with the foot of the T pointing toward the street. Open porch on three sides of that section that projects toward the street. Unfortunately, this part of the porch has been enclosed, as we've seen so many other times as well. But the rest of it is unchanged. The windows in the second floor have been changed. Today, the wooden decoration around the porch roof line, that's gone. But the scroll saw cut column capitals are still intact there. And the sort of teardrop shaped decorations along the raking cornice are still intact. Partly the style was encouraged by the development of the bandsaw. I talked last time about circular saws and how you can't cut this kind of decoration with a circular saw. But as the bandsaw was developed, and it's a blade that's about 3/4 to an inch wide and has teeth on the narrow side, and it goes up and down in the machine. And you can cut out this kind of decoration. You can cut out these circular forms. You can cut out these elaborate floral forms with the bandsaw. So once again, technology is pushing. A desire for something new, something different is pulling. It's almost impossible to say which pushed and which pulled the most. But that's our best surviving Gothic revival house in town. About the only one, too, for that matter. We're really short. I'm sorry? Okay. Next slide. Here's the way it looked circa 1890, 1900. You see it had a full window up here. You see the woodwork much better shape than it was when I was photographing it. And all the natural foliage is very much part of this sub-style of the cottage Gothic. You want it to look like it's out in the country, and ivy covering the cottage. It also uses board and batten, which is almost never used except in the Gothic revival style. And you see that here on the front. You put your boards vertically, butt them up against each other, and then put a thin strip that we call a batten. You see those thin strips covering the joints between the boards. So board and batten was quite commonly used in the Gothic revival, especially for cottages or small scale buildings. Next slide.
We had a 60s style ranch with board and batten construction, partially.
Okay. That's curious that somebody would be bringing that back. Were there many in the neighborhood or any others?
Yeah, it was fairly common. Now, this was in the Milwaukee area.
Okay,
Yeah, there were quite a few.
probably some builder that said, hey, this is a good idea, a good selling point. I don't talk about the commercial end of this sort of thing very often, but it's very much part of our story. What the contractor finds will sell in a particular area can be very important and can create essentially a whole sub-style. In other cases, there's a neoclassical house, big brick house on King, about 14th and King. Brick, two-story. It's got a big portico, pediment in front of it, on 4 columns. Only one like it in town. They can't give the darn thing away. It's been on the market for months. It's not a style that's common around here. If we moved it to northern Mississippi, I could sell 100 of them, because it is very typical of northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, parts of Tennessee. But up here, it's different, and nobody wants it. So peculiar personal taste, or maybe I should say just simply personal taste, whether we consider it peculiar or not, oftentimes affects what happens with buildings. Here out of an 1850 design book by Andrew Jackson Downing, you see a very typical little Gothic revival cottage, just pretty much like what we've been looking at. 2 rooms, kitchen added on the rear, might have been original or you might have added it on later. That's a very common kind of basic house plan. Where would they have gotten the idea for the Cephas Martindale house? Probably from this book or one similar to it. There were a couple of them out at that point in time that the carpenter could have been looking at, sitting down with Mr. Martindale and saying, what appeals to you? You know, you go to get your wedding dress, you sit down with a book and say, okay, I want this kind of fabric, I like that, I don't like these kinds of fabrics, I want this kind of ribbon. It's the same thing with houses in the past. Next slide. Same thing except more elaborate and done in stone. So we've got fancy cut stone along the roof line. We've got a fancy pointed arch over the entrance, but it's the same basic design as the little cottage was. Larger, more elaborate, but the same basic design. It is the pointed arch, as opposed to the round arch, that gives the Gothic Revival style its most distinctive feature. That's the only style that makes use of the pointed arch, is the Gothic Revival. Whereas Roman uses the round arch, Renaissance Revival, Baroque Revival, Colonial Revival, they all make use of the round arch, but just the pointed arch in the Gothic style.
The arch on that little balcony, that's rounded, isn't it?
That is, yeah, that's a rounded one. But that's, we're going back to what I've said before with this mixture. Oriole window, or hanging bay window, some people call them, quite unusual. You could do it with stone much easier than you could with wood. Although we do get a few of these hanging oriole windows in the 1880s here in La Crosse. There are a pair, twin houses over on Ferry, I believe it is, that make use of them. Next slide. Here's a cross comparison with the little house on Cass Street versus the big house, but same basic elements. The Gothic Revival loved tall, slim chimneys. and that'll be carried over into the Queen Anne style. The Gothic Revival also brought bay windows, most often three-sided bay windows, into common usage. They get carried over into the Italianate style, into the mansard style, into all sorts of later styles, because people like them. So even though they aren't typically part of this style or that style, the woman whose husband's paying for the house wants a bay window because they're great for house plants. And there was at least 3 different waves of houseplant mania that swept through La Crosse in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Even relatively small houses having large greenhouses. Next slide. Here a detail of that woodwork, that wonderful floral form coming off the square columns. Truly, Gothic Revival should have octagonal columns. Neither round nor square, but octagonal. But this is poor man's Gothic. This is 1850s Gothic. I mean, when we were really still scratching a living out of the riverbank here in La Crosse. It also shows you the board and batten a little better. But only in this upper gable. The rest of the house has standard clapboarding. Don't know why, except this is what's going to be the most seen, so that's where they used it, I guess. Next slide. A little half house just down the street on Cass. It's been altered again, so you might not recognize it from this slide. But in your mind, you got to take off that porch, that closes up the angle between the main wing and the wing that comes out towards you. I call it a half Gothic because it doesn't have the other wing. And some of these houses were built like that, and then as you get more money, you add the other wing. This remained a rental house for years and years and years, and so nothing was done with it. About the only thing that shows that it is Gothic Revival is the very steep angle to the roof, which is Gothic Revival, and these decorative little clover leaf shapes in the cornice boards around the gable end. Some people call them verge boards. That's a proper term for this form. Other people call them barge boards, which is a corruption of verge board. And that's what, or where, what some people call the gingerbread on Gothic Revival houses is usually found, is in those gables and on the porch. Next slide. Here's a slightly different angle. Next. By 1870, we're up to 1870, we had the Civil War and you didn't even notice it. It went right by. Things are booming after the Civil War. And house architecture begins to boom as well. One of the very curious styles that developed right after the Civil War was the Second Empire style. Borrowed from France, the Napoleon II in Paris, I think he was the nephew of the first Napoleon, he creates a new empire and remodels much of downtown Paris, which was a medieval slum in many, many areas. He also put a tax on houses that were taller than 4 stories. And so the enterprising French promptly created very steep roofed houses with large dormer windows in the attic so they could get another floor without paying taxes. And it is that phenomenon that we call the mansard roof, M-A-N-S-A-R-D. It's named after the curve to the roof line. Well, you can see it back here better. So it's not a straight slope, it's a curved slope. Sometimes it's concave, like this one. Other times it bellies out and is convex. And that's very typical of this mansard roof that was used in the Second Empire style. That's about the only feature of the Second Empire style that gets to La Crosse, is the very distinctive roof line. Second Empire style works best with large-scale buildings. The State War and Navy building in Washington is probably the best example, one of the best examples in the world of Second Empire style. And it has layer upon layer upon layer of columns supporting entablatures, which are supporting larger columns that support still larger entablatures, and it's just layered with decoration. Well, this is a stripped down La Crosse version. We get the mansard roof, we get three-sided bays, one here, there's one on the front, there's one on the front over here, there's one around over on the side over here, corresponding to that one. But as I said before, that's a Gothic revival element now carried over into the Second Empire style. But that very distinctive roof line is really what separates these out from all the other houses of the time. This is the one directly across, well, not directly, but catty-cornered across the street, that ugly stucco building. That's the W.C. Bussell house. Bussell was a lumberman, moved into this house about 1870. It was designed by William Nichols, who was the most prolific of the various carpenter builders that was working in La Crosse in the 1860s and 70s. He was responsible for almost every three-story building in downtown today. Was designed by Nichols back in the late 60s, the early 70s, and are still our primary mercantile area. Next slide. Here's a little more recent view of it. You can see that terrible stucco with a worm-like pattern all over it. You can see the bay window over here and the bay window here, as well as the bays in front. So he really wanted to get lots of light into the interior. This is also a good image to show you the dangers of aluminum framed windows. See how they just completely destroy the shape, the color of those dormers. So, well, we needn't say anything about aluminum storm doors either. It's perfectly, clear how inappropriate these are. And this silly little railing around the porch, obviously not in keeping with the time or the place. But again, the house is basically there. It's been altered, but it's there. It can be brought back, and its position here on Main Street is a very significant position in the community. And I can only hope that something good will happen to this house. And it may.
What would you consider a good alternative to that kind of storm on historic home? Double pane glass as opposed to a storm window on the outside?
That's certainly one, or now you can get storm windows in a variety of enameled colors over the aluminum. So it's not just that raw aluminum. There's been a whole tremendous industry that's developed in the last 20 years to fulfill the needs of people who want to do high quality restoration on buildings like this. And several younger architects here in town that are doing the work now that no one would have done in the past because no one was interested. We really are living in an interesting time in terms of people wanting to connect back with the past for whatever reason. I mean, that's one reason you're here. You're curious about what happened in the past, in this case with buildings.
Isn't this building painted just about the color of that Volkswagen now?
Yeah, now it's about the color of that VW, yeah. A little more obnoxious.
Yes. It's horrible.
Next slide. Here you see that typical mansard roof. This isn't any particular house in La Crosse. This is just an elevation from a builder's guidebook that I brought along to show you the typical mansard roof with fancy dormers on it. Next slide. Here's a townhouse kind of design with a bay window on one side, an entranceway projected out towards you, a nice tower. Here you see that convex mansard roof that bellies out rather than the concave that curves in. Oftentimes with metal cresting over the roof in various points, particularly on towers. They like that metal cresting. And of course it rusts, and rather than getting up there and painting it, people take it down. And so a detail that once was very important to the house disappears, and you never know it was there. Next slide. We do have two photo images from Mr. Bussell's house, made by a Winona firm of Elmer and Tenney, who were very industrious photographers in the 1860s, 70s, into the 1880s. You know, photography hit the world pretty much the way computers have hit the world in terms of making all sorts of things possible that had never been possible before, turning the world upside down in a variety of ways. And one of the interesting developments with photography was the view camera that had stereo lenses, 2 lenses. So when you took the photograph, the object you were photographing would be photographed from 2 slightly different angles. Well, you make 2 prints, 1 print from each camera lens, put those on a card, and put that card in your stereo viewer. And you look through the stereo viewer, and it's 3-dimensional. Every household in America had a stereo viewer. It might have been one of the cheap ones that you could get down at Woolworth and Company. Might be very elaborate, velvet lined with a artificial enclosure for a light source. Some of them were extremely fancy. Parties, stereo parties. So you'd get together and you'd swap stereo images among neighbors or family. What you used to do with your comic books back in the old days. Anyway, Elmer and Tenney made a number of stereo views of buildings in La Crosse, and this is one of them, and shows you the interior of the Bussell house. This would have been circa 1881 to 85, sometime in that time range. We can't date it specifically. We know he was in town in 1881. No record of him coming to La Crosse from Winona before that, but we're pretty sure he came several times after that. So 81 at the earliest, more likely it's probably mid-1880s. Gas lighting. When the globes turn up, it's gas. When the glass globes turn down, it's electrical. Very simple way to remember, because many of these gas fixtures were electrified later on. And really all you had to do was just unscrew the arm and turn it down because you wanted to project the electric light down into the room, whereas with the gas light, you've got to have the chimney going up to get rid of the burn particles and the absence of oxygen and, you know, keep the oxygen moving into that gas to keep the light going. So very elaborate chandelier with city gas. There were a couple of companies that made gas that they would pipe to your house, or if you were very wealthy, you could get your own gas generating system out in the shed in the backyard. Mix carbide and water, makes acetylene gas, and that's basically what they used was acetylene gas. Lace, 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 lace. It's all over the place. What had once been a luxury item created by little old widows in Belgium and Holland now has become a mass-produced factory item with yards of lace being turned out by factories back on the East Coast. So if you want to show your prestige, you fill your house full of lace curtains. It shows your wealth, your prosperity, even though these are now mass-produced, manufactured lace curtains. Every wealthy house, or even most middle-class houses, had musical instruments of some sort. If you didn't play or sing, you really were left out of the entertainment world because it was what was happening in your neighborhood, in your own house, where most of your entertainment was. Quite elaborate Baroque revival piano. Again, the more decoration, the better in the eyes of many of these people. These folks in La Crosse that are making their fortunes, like Bussell. Bussell didn't come from a wealthy background. And as soon as his lumber company started making money, he started buying all the stuff that symbolizes, I am important. I've got a horse and buggy. Most people didn't have horses and buggies. Horses are very expensive to take care of. They're an awful lot of work to take care of. So most people walked down to the grocery store, and the grocery store delivered your 50-pound sack of flour. That's simply the way it was. Or you rented a carriage or a wagon from the livery stable. But Bussell built his own stable for his horses. Chairs, heavily upholstered. Again, another way of showing you've made it. You have comfortable furniture, not just a hard wooden bench or a wooden bottom chair. Now we've got fancy. We've got wall-to-wall carpeting. And on top of the carpeting, we put rugs. It's layer after layer after layer of decoration in these places. Conspicuous consumption, really, I mean, that's the name of the late 19th century. Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age. Everything was gilded. It wasn't real gold. It was gold leaf. The whole notion of gilding is, of course, sort of derogatory. It's fake. It's not the real stuff. It's theater. It's for show. Next slide. Here we're looking in the dining room, back into the parlor where you see the piano we were just looking at. A little bit of aesthetic movement coming in, which also leads me to believe this is probably mid-1880s to late 1880s. This kind of screen, room screen, with just a very simple shape of cattails, very Japanese. Japanese became quite popular. Japanese design, Japanese paintings, Japanese ceramics, maybe the bowls. We'll see some other examples of living rooms clearly showing Japanese porcelain that's being purchased here in La Crosse. Well, you could go down to your, O.J. Oyen, interior design firm, would have had Japanese porcelain for sale, would have had Japanese style room screens for sale to keep up with his customers' interest. So side by side with the very simple Japanese aesthetic of as little as possible, you know, we've got a Baroque Revival sideboard with mirrors and shelves above shelves above shelves, and all the family silver that we just bought a couple of months ago down at the Silver Company, all out here on display for everybody to see. Next slide. If you read your textbook carefully, you remember that at the end of my discussion on this house, I said last summer that the future of this house was really looking pretty grim. And two friends that are architectural restoration people decided to make me look like an idiot. And so they bought the house and they're restoring it now. And it's going to be one of the great triumphs of preservation in the community. Look at these wings over here and here. Obviously, porches that have been enclosed. The Second Empire style roof, obviously that is very much in evidence too, and that's what tends to give it its Second Empire sort of status. But in fact, it started out life as a cruciform-shaped Italianate house. Let me have the next slide. Very bad image taken as a detail from a much larger image. But this is the original house with a wing going crosswise to the street, a large wing coming out toward the street, and then a lower kitchen wing at the rear. So this was what Mr. Esperson built, brick, would have had stone arches over the windows. You can see the stone, the white stone picked out against the brick. That's what was there originally. Pettibone bought the house in the late 70s or early 80s and turned it into a Second Empire style house. Next slide. Redid the roof and then added this wraparound porch. That's all he did, add this wraparound porch and the change the roof line to make what was a very lovely Italianate brick house into a now Second Empire style house. And it was in here where those porches are that those ugly enclosed porches were added. Don't know when, but probably in the 1940s when La Crosse was really a booming war town with a number of war-related industries. And trying to find a place to sleep in La Crosse was a real problem. So they didn't close a porch like this and make it into a bedroom, sitting room, and that was it. This is what you got. An 8 by 10 at best space. This is an interesting porch. The porch isn't really Second Empire. Second Empire didn't use this lightweight kind of material. This is all frame, wood spindle work up in the top, wood lathe turn columns on the porch. This is all really Queen Anne decoration. So we've got an Italianate house with a mansard roof with Queen Anne porch. Pure? No, nothing pure about it. But fun, interesting, livable? Yeah, it was. Here's a little tip or trick. You notice there's two stairways in this house. Well, was it a duplex? No, it wasn't. One's the official entry. Over here, where you see the pediment above it, that's the public entrance, the official entrance. It leads you up to the front door. Over here, that's the family entrance. That goes to a door into the bay window that leads you into the family parlor. So just the arrangement of doorways indicates status as part of the whole design. And of course, the servants or the delivery people would go around to the back. But if you were friends of the family, you'd use the family entrance. If it was an official call of some sort, you'd use the official main doorway. Next slide. This is the design I'm talking about with this house we were just looking at, and common in many, many, many houses in La Crosse. It's an offset plan. So we have our basic rectangle, but over to one side we have an offset, a section that sticks out from the side of the other. It's not a whole wing going a different direction. It's just one part of the house is wider to create this secondary entrance. So this would be the formal entrance. It would go into a hallway that would run all the way back into the rear of the house and even out the back side to the backyard. There would also be a stairway along this wall leading to the second floor. Then over here is the family entrance, each having a little porch. Doesn't have to be very big. Here a very small one-bay entry porch, somewhat larger porch I put over here on the side because this is where you would sit outside. You wouldn't sit out on your main porch. That would be pretty crude, yeah, gauche. So you'd sit out here on the family veranda. But in the Queen Anne style, somebody said, why don't we link these porches together? And that's exactly what happened at the Esperson Pettibone house that we were just looking at. They did a sweep of the porch around the house. Next slide. Here's showing you the same thing. We also added a bay window. As long as we're remodeling, we might as well put a bay window in there on the side. And then our wraparound porch. Next slide. Of all the styles, Italianate is probably the most fun because it's so chaotic. It goes every direction imaginable. There's no rules. At least when we were doing Greek or Gothic, we had rules. We had ancient houses. We had houses from the Middle Ages. We had prototypes that we're going to copy or we're going to follow. But Italianate means Italian-like. Well, like what Italian? An Italian from Naples? Very different Italian from the one from Milan or the one from Rome or Siena. There is no Italian style because there wasn't even in Italy until 1871, 1872, sometime about then, that the various provinces of what we call Italy today finally came together and became a separate nation. Before, they were provinces owned by France or by the church or by Sicily. Spain owned part of Italy. Everybody owned part of Italy except the Italians. So in the Italianate style, we often get the use of brackets here under the eaves of the cupola, under the eaves of the porch. Supposedly, these represent the tail of the joist in the ceiling sticking out of the house. And so we carved them. Well, now, why you didn't just cut them off flush with the wall, I don't know. But anyway, that's the story, that these are supposedly the decorated ends of the joist sticking out from the house. If it sells houses, it's a good story. You know, I'm sure architects came up with these kinds of nonsensical stories back then the same way they do now. This house is particularly delicate with the paired columns, or actually they're colonnettes, little columns on pedestals. We don't see that very often. That's another characteristic element that this guy William Nichols used. And I'm absolutely positive that he did the design for this house. I've also suggested to you that he was responsible for every one of the houses that had a cupola, with the exception of one here in town. When you go by the Martindale house, again, if you look closely or you look clearly, you'll see that the back end part of the Martindale house is at a different height from the front end. Well, this was the old house. This was the original house, built about 1856. Then the large parlor, upstairs bedrooms, they were added about 1869 by Nichols, and the cupola added to it. So the earlier house is back here. You'll see difference in the size of the windows. And that's a very clear indicator usually that something's happening to change these things. He also uses the 4 panes of glass in 2 rows for his windows to give you very tall windows, just like we saw over at the Tudor house. Some designers have ways of doing things that are successful for them. They like these kinds of proportions. They like these kinds of shapes. And oftentimes a designer will leave his fingerprints all over a building just by what he chooses to do or not to do. So we can very often say, I'm just positive this was by Nichols because of this and this and this and this. Other times we have, documents. We don't always have documentary evidence of the past on some of these houses, so we have to interpolate from what we do have. And based on what I've seen of houses that I know was designed by Nichols, I know this is absolutely William Nichols at his best. He loved these pedestals. He loved using the smaller, more delicate columns. They're more graceful. Visually, they're lighter in weight, so they seem to lift you up. And this house, which is really all slab sides, I mean, this is basically just verticals and horizontals with very little in the way of relieving decoration, except this delightful little porch that runs around the outside. Next slide, let's look at a detail. Notice how he's paired his brackets so that there's a bracket for each colonnette. He could have used just one big colonnette or one big bracket, but that would have been a very different effect from the paired brackets with the paired colonnettes. The brackets on the upper floor correspond to the brackets on the ground floor. The brackets on the cupola correspond all the way up and down. So keeping the forms, repeating the forms, but creating variety in terms of its heights, and the overall design comes out marvelously. This too is one of those offset designs with a entrance back here. There's also another entrance back here that runs off the side of the porch, but that's because of the original house is slightly offset from the addition when this addition was made. Next slide. Great pilaster here. Nichols is still thinking in terms of neoclassicism. In some of his other designs, he would use just a straight corner board, not any pretension at all. But here he uses a pilaster with a fancy capital that echoes the shape of the window heads. Form, echoing form. Very important for him. Curious little curlicue he uses here to hide that difference in height between the old house and the new house. Never seen it done like that. It works. It does what he intended it to do. So it's another case of Mr. Nichols being extremely creative in his solving of problems. Next slide.
Well, what kind of what is it?
I'm sorry?
What is it? What was it? What was the thing, that red thing that you saw?
Oh, it's just a flat board, basically,
Okay.
series of boards.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, no thickness to it, just a little bit of visual definition there. Here a detail of the colonnettes. His pedestals even have some inset molding in the pedestal itself. So you don't have just a square box, you've got a decorative box that contributes to the whole effect. This is really one of the jewels of Lacrosse in terms of it's the only one left like this that's basically intact. Next slide. A little further detail of that capital and the inset molding on the pilaster. Large, robust brackets. These were usually made as a sandwich, so there'd be three layers. So there's a layer, and then a layer, and then a layer. And by varying the size of each layer, you can create these heavy shadow patterns. So that you see that curlicue in there, not because it's painted, but because it's dark. The contrast of light and dark creates the curlicue that you get in there. And the surface, the front of that bracket, the two outer boards extend slightly beyond the center board that makes up the bracket. So again, you get a shadow line. We just don't see the world the way they did in the 19th century. That we've been trained, our machines have trained us. Your automobile and your television have trained you how to see the world around you. And it's a very limited view of the world that you have that's conditioned by your automobile driving. I mean, if you spend years and years and years driving an automobile, you're conditioned to look at a very narrow slice of the world. So when you get out and you walk along the streets of Lacrosse, you're not looking up, you're looking at your automobile windshield. And then television changes the world 4 or 5 times a second, and you keep up with it. So the whole idea of stopping to look at a capital on a house and say, Mr. Nichols really did a fine job on that house. We just don't do it anymore. We don't see that way anymore. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just simply saying that's the way it is. We don't. And that's, you're having to train yourself to look at the world differently. And I'm pointing out to you, look at this, look at that shadow pattern, look at how this relates to that. So I'm trying to retrain your eye. But, you know, I've only got 8 sessions to retrain your eye. And that's hard going against 30 years of driving a car. Next slide, please. Great little window heads with more scroll brackets supporting that window head. Next slide. And the cupola. The rhythm of the arches. How many arches do you fit in that space? We could have used 2 big ones, could have used 3 middle-sized ones, chose to use 4 smaller ones. It's a rhythm that works. 2 would have been too big, too heavy, too massive. After all, this is perched way up in the air. You want it to look lightweight. If you build this thing to look like a fortress, it's going to be pushing down visually on the rest of the house. So you want that upward sweep. The colonnettes lead you up. The arches of the cupola do the same thing.
Was that used for ventilation, or what did you use it for?
Strictly ventilation. Yeah, you open the windows in the cupola at night and open the windows on the ground floor of the house, and the air goes right up. I'll tell you a story. When I was a kid, we used to have feather races. I had a friend who had a big southern mansion with grand staircase in the center and a cupola above it. And we'd go out to the chicken yard and we'd get fluff, chicken fluff, not real feathers, but the down that's light, and come into the hallway and let them go. And then run up the stairs to see whose feather went out the cupola first. That was entertainment on a hot summer evening in the South. So yeah, they do work. When you can see a feather go up and out, you know that they're working. Next slide. Here's a illustration from Samuel Sloan's book. I mentioned Sloan last time. That's where William Nichols got the window framing that we looked at and the 2 rows of 4-pane glass that we saw over at the Tudor house. Here's a design for a villa, an Italianate type of house with a cupola that Nichols would have seen. We know he owned Sloan's book, so he would have seen this illustration. It's from this that he probably took the idea of the cupola. He didn't copy it exactly, he made it his own. He used the proportions that were relevant to the design he was working on. But that's where the cupola idea comes from. It was from Samuel Sloan's book in 1852. So the book was published in 1852, and we're getting a cupola at the Tudor house in 1856. That's only 4 years later. So that's a pretty quick adaptation of a new idea by a local builder. Next slide. Here's the interior of the Martindale house when it was being restored. The vice president of Heileman Brewery, Thomas Carroll, bought the house after Catherine Martindale died, and he had the interior completely gutted, redid the electrical, redid the heating, cooling, really turned it into a functioning house again. This shows the very massive woodwork of this doorway into the front parlor. This is the front door you see right through there. So these pocket doors closing off the front parlor. You also see the blinds, window blinds that fold into the sides of the window pocket when they're not in use, or can be folded out to block the sun. Next slide. And of course, the spiral staircase. It was an absolute necessity for anyone who wanted to claim they had a real honest-to-goodness mansion. You had to have a spiral staircase. Just a right-angle staircase going up wasn't good enough. It had to be circular or a spiral. because they were very complicated to build. So you got to get a better quality workman, which implies a better job. So spiral staircases were all the rage, and prior to the Civil War and for a few years afterwards. Next slide. Ceiling rosettes, again, in 1700s, these would have been carved out of plaster by guys whose specialty it was. By 1859, 1860, there were companies back on the East Coast that were making these plaster rosettes in molds, which is a lot quicker and easier than carving each one of them by hand. They'd come in two parts, put them together, butter the back of each half with plaster, stick it to the plaster ceiling, run a couple of screws into it to hold it in place until the plaster glue solidifies, and you've got a nice ceiling rosette. Then you can run your gas line through the hole in the center, or later your electrical wiring through that hole to your chandelier. Again, one of these special items that only the wealthy could afford in the 1700s. In the 1800s, you can pick it out of your Sears catalog and order this style or that style or that style. Next slide. Here's the interior of the Martindale house. I have no idea when this was taken. It could have been any time after 1880, 1890, all the way up to the 1940s. Catherine Martindale lived there by herself for many, 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 many years, and the house just did not change for a long, long time. You laughed when I said earlier about rugs on top of carpets, but here they are again, for sure. Nice decorations on the walls, usually engravings, black and white engravings. Color chromolithographs come around in the late 1880s, and for the first time people can have color in their house without, something hand-colored, watercolor or hand-done painting of some sort. Now you can get photographic color in these engravings. Here you see the chandelier globes pointed up, again indicating that that's gas-fed originally. Some of these gas-fed ones were converted to electrical, so you sometimes get electrical features that have the globes pointed up as well, but in the original configuration, down for gas, up for electricity. Backwards, yeah. Next slide. Different shot, this ottoman and the edge of the sofa here was in the earlier photo. I like this view of the room much better. Nice rocking chair with a lamp above it and lots of books. Mr. Martindale was, her father was quite a book man himself. He sold insurance in town. Next slide.
You said that the main addition was 4 years after the original house?
The original Martindale house was, I think, 56. Somebody check the book. Anyway, it's in the book. Yeah. Italianate varieties. This little house has fascinated me ever since I came to town. I love this is a hip roof. A hip roof comes up on all four sides, whereas a gable, it's just two sides sloped. But with a hip roof, all four slope up. Plus, you've got a gable in the front. So this is a gable and a hip roof. And you've got that two-story bay that I was talking about earlier on a different house, and here you've got another one. And this house has always just sort of said to me that, you know, there's more here than meets the eye. And last summer, just before this class started up, Anita got a photograph. Let's show them the photograph. Little porch on the front, single bay porch on the front, somewhat larger porch here on the side for the family entrance. You see the bay window, very nicely treated. It's a delightful house. But all the detail has been lost by the siding, by the aluminum siding, by the ugly porches. So this was Peck, a man named Peck, who was a newspaper editor. Moved to Milwaukee later on, was governor of Wisconsin eventually, published the book Peck's Bad Boys, quite nationally known figure. But this is a house he lived in La Crosse. Very typical offset design. It was modernized not too long after Peck sold it. Next slide. If we look at it over here, we see the porches have changed, that now it's a wraparound porch. So even in the past, people were modernizing. Okay, my house is 20 years old, 25 years old. The Italianate style is kind of out. I'll put this Queen Anne style porch on my house. That, of course, makes it very difficult for restoring. Do you go back to the very original? Do you go back to this period? It's as legitimate a house as the first design of the house was. So sometimes you have to make decisions about preservation and what do you want to preserve and how do you want to preserve it. Right next to it is a lovely middle-class Queen Anne called the Mariner House that we'll look at later. And then if we move on down the street, here's another one of those little rectangular houses with the front porch that's been enclosed that we've seen elsewhere. Housing was very unsegregated, especially economically in La Crosse, so that you might have a middle-class house right next to what we would consider a very low-income dwelling. Now, when you got out on Cass and King, beyond West Avenue, that's all high-priced realty area, so you didn't find that. But in the early years of La Crosse, you would often find a mixture of time periods and styles. Almost always building up on the corners first, and then filling in the middle of the block as the years went by. Next slide. Here's that comparison. Next slide. See if you can enlarge on the porch columns. Okay. Look at these. We got a 8-foot long 4x4, and it's set on a lathe, so it's spinning. And you got a whole series of knives that you cut into it. It's all square to start with, like the top and the bottom that you see here. And then you begin cutting into the center part to make these rings. Or you can do it like the one next door and make kind of balls here and here. And the whole thing tapers. You can run a pair of these off in 15, 20 minutes on a lathe without much trouble. So everybody in town could have exactly the same front porch, but they'd look different because everybody had different columns. Well, that's part of the mass production, which in some cases means everything is exactly alike, but in other cases, mass production can be harnessed to create a variety of objects. And of course, what kind of balusters you use, what kind of spindles you use up in the top, what kind of capitals you put on your columns. These funny little things, I don't know of any other like them in lacrosse. They work. They visually create a capital-like shape, but quite unusual. Next slide. Same thing, I forgot I had this detail, but you can see the difference in the columns. So that's over on 8th, no, that's 8th, 9th and King. It would be this one. Next slide. The cruciform shaped Italianate, when I say cruciform, cross-like, generally means we've got a long central unit and then two arms that come out from the sides like the arms of a cross, which is what you've got here. This is the younger brother of W.C. Bussell. This is H.D. Bussell, who ran a grocery store. And this house is on State Street, 914, it's a block over, still there, beautiful shape. Next slide. The tree's still there too, that they planted. But the house is basically intact. They did take off the brackets that were on the underside of the eave when it was remodeled. One of the things they did do, they did put siding on it, but they used the 4.5-inch wide siding rather than the 6-inch or the 10-inch. So this is the same width siding as would have been on the house originally when it was wood. Next slide. Major change is in the downstairs parlor window. That would have looked like the one upstairs, except it had a flat head the way it does now, and it would have been two narrow windows in there. Double leaf front door. That is two parts to the front door that swung out. Very common in the Italianate style and carried over into the Queen Anne. Next. A simpler version, lower middle class, mid-middle class, somewhere in their version, has one of the wings, doesn't have the other wing going off the other direction. So it just has the long section and then a side section. This is an interesting sub-example because now they've started using vestibules. So that instead of the porch opening directly into the house, there's an airlock, transitional space, a vestibule, a place to get rid of your galoshes and coats, and also helps moderate the temperature between inside and outside. We've got an old photo of this house. Next slide. So nothing there really has changed. It originally has a vestibule with a little bit of stained glass. Stained glass starts coming in the 1880s and is cheap enough to where even in a fairly simple house like this, you can use it. Hundreds of these all over La Crosse. I mean, they really were turned out by the dozens and dozens and dozens because they worked very well as a living unit. Next slide. We'll finish up with the McCord-McCulloch house. that's on the corner of 11th and Cass. This is an older photo of it. Next slide, let's go on. Here's another view of it from about 1910. They put this heavy colonial revival porch on the house about 1910. And it really did not suit the house very well. And they also painted the whole thing one solid color of dark green. Next slide. So many of you probably remember this house. I mean, this big, hulking, dark green mass sitting on the corner with that colonial revival porch that was screened in, which made it even more massive looking. The north side is just a wonder of windows. Different sizes, different shapes, but organized as we get like this grouping of 3, and then above that the grouping of 2, and then the single window above that and the gable. So we're building from large to medium to small. We're also getting contrast, such as the large windows here for the stair hall and this relatively small little unit here in the foyer when you come into the house. So it really was quite dramatic in its earlier manifestations. It has been rehabbed, next slide, with a very fine hand. I'll show you in a minute. Look at these brackets. Aren't they wonderful? You also see some incising here in the pediments over the windows, and that's very much part of the aesthetic style. And so we've got an Italianate design with aesthetic style windows. Next slide. Very typical for Italianate coloring. You use light colored walls with dark trim, or you use dark walls with light colored trim. So you get the contrast. And you know, what a contrast. I mean, this is really a vastly different house. The owners, we couldn't tell what the original porch looked like. We've got no photographs that go back far enough to show us the original porch. So the owners decided to simply use basic square columns for the porch, rather than trying to fake it and pretend it's something it wasn't. It's just minimal, doesn't take your eye away from the rest of the house, but serves its purpose. Next slide. Here you can see some of that aesthetic style decoration that's been picked out in a different color. Again, very subtle. That's the kind of thing you're going to see from a car going 30 miles an hour, zoom by the house. You're going to have to take your time and go walking and look at what lies there. That should be about it. Hit one more and see what we've got. Oh no, we've got the Hickson. We've got to finish up with the Hickson house. The Hickson house is a mess. It has been added on to, and the additions have been added to, and the additions on the additions have been added to. Why one of the richest men in town decided to stay in one of the poorest parts of town, I have no clue whatsoever. But the Hicksons decided to stay where they were, which was a residential area for working class people and then became a commercial district. But the Hicksons remained there. This is their house, taken from 1868 map. It's that 3-bay front with the side entrance into a stair hall, a secondary entrance, family entrance back here into an earlier house. So this was the first house. It got the big front added. It got a kitchen added off the rear. Next slide. So here we're looking directly at the front. So this wing over here was all added. This wing over there was all added. Next slide. The nook, Turkish nook that's in here was added. The bay window here was added about 1901 for the Hicksons. When the family, there were a number of Hickson boys. When they grew up, they left town. The house was owned by for many years by Alice Green Hickson. When she finally died, the family left it to the La Crosse County Historical Society. Now, you go to most historical homes around the country, and they will tell you that this is furnished in the period of the Smith house or in the style of the Jones house. We don't do that here. The Hickson house has the original furniture. It has the original sheets. It has the original rugs. It has the original stationery. The whole house is there. Alice Green Hickson inherited it all. She died. It was passed to the County Historical Society basically intact. I don't know how far you'd have to hunt to find another house that can say of this age that it is original. Next slide. Always very simple house, very plain, although the interior was quite elaborate. Here you see Alice Hickson sitting in the parlor. Next slide. So not only do we have the original furniture, we've got photos of the original house showing us where the furniture was. So it's really a time capsule when you go back into time. Next slide. This is the double parlor to one side of the house. Next slide. I've got some color. Here, finally, we get some color. Several years ago, multi-million-dollar restoration. Margaret Lichter from here in La Crosse did a marvelous job of redoing the wallpaper, the fabrics, all of the ephemera of the house that had either been lost or covered over. This was Gideon Hickson's study. Next slide. The nook, the Turkish nook. Turkish nooks were all the rage in the 1880s as we got reacquainted with Egypt, because most of this is actually Egyptian, or the little ivory inlaid table is could be Indian, could be Mughal, could be a variety of origins. So when they were talking about the Turkish corner or the Turkish nook, it was strictly a name. You shouldn't automatically assume that everything in there is going to be Turkish. But it was a fun kind of place to just relax and read on an afternoon. Next slide. Yep, that's the last one. So if you really want to see an Italianate house, go to the Hickson house. They're open now. Take your friends and visitors to see a real Italianate house. We'll start out from the rear of the library and we'll go quickly down 9th Street and then cut back over to 8th and go up to Cass Street to look at the Cephas Martindale house. So see you in the rear shortly.
Let's take the long